The chamber fell into a heavy silence, the king's decree settling over the council like dust after a collapse. One by one, the generals inclined their heads. Even the cautious adviser, though reluctance lingered in the set of his jaw, bowed in submission. "My lord," he said quietly, "your will is ours. The archers and ballistae will be made ready." The king gave a single nod and turned back toward the window. Far beyond the glass, the anchored fleet lingered on the darkening water, little more than jagged silhouettes against a dying band of light. His hand drifted to the hilt of his sword. The metal caught the last glow of evening, a cold, unwavering gleam that mirrored the resolve in his eyes. "Send word to every commander," he ordered. "The ridges will be manned before first light, ballistae drawn, archers prepared. We strike at dawn, when sleep still clings to them and the sun blinds their watch." His gaze hardened. "Let fire fall before they understand what hunts them. Let the sea swallow what remains." No one spoke. They bowed and withdrew, their footsteps fading into the long arteries of the castle as the machinery of war began to turn in earnest. Outside, discipline replaced panic. Units formed and reformed in torchlit courtyards. Runners carried sealed commands through narrow streets. Engineers checked torsion ropes, tested winches, stacked bolts as tall as spears. Along the coastal defences, tar pots were opened, their sharp scent cutting through the salt air. Night descended slowly over Shadow Bay. Lanterns flickered to life across the walls, constellations forged by human hands to rival the emerging stars. Yet beyond that fragile ring of light, the bay remained vast and unknowable. The enemy ships did not move. Their sails hung slack. No signal fires burned, no horns sounded across the water. They simply endured the dark, as patient as stones. It was the stillness that unsettled the veterans most. Armies usually betrayed themselves through noise, through fear, through the restless shifting of men awaiting violence. But this fleet waited without a whisper. High on the mountain ridges, archers stood shoulder to shoulder among the mist-wrapped trees. Bowstrings were checked and rechecked by touch alone. Quivers sat open at their feet. No one wasted words. Even murmurs felt like an intrusion upon the night. From his hill, the fisherman watched the twin lines of torchlight tracing the city walls and wondered which would fade first, those fragile flames, or the lives that guarded them. The anchored ships looked almost abandoned now, dark hulks rocking gently with the tide. Almost harmless. Yet the air carried that same tightening pressure, like the breathless pause before a storm breaks. He could not name the source of his dread, only feel it coiling deeper with every passing hour. Below him, thousands prepared for a battle they believed would be swift. Across the water, an enemy waited with a patience that suggested something far more dangerous than courage. And overhead, the night stretched on, silent, watchful, unwilling to reveal which side it favoured. The wind strengthened as the night deepened, sweeping in from the open sea with a restless edge. It carried the familiar scent of salt, yet threaded through it now was the faint bitterness of smoke, so subtle it might have been imagined. The ocean continued its low, wandering song. Once it had spoken of distance and freedom. Tonight it sounded like the first murmur of a storm gathering just beyond sight. Inside the castle the hour had grown late, but sleep had abandoned every corridor. "My lord," a guard said, kneeling at the foot of the throne. Though he held himself rigid, unease leaked into his voice. "This army, it is unlike any we have faced. Some among their ranks carry no weapons at all. They walk toward us empty-handed, And their king, he faltered briefly. Their king shows no sign of concern. That, more than anything, troubles me. The king lifted his head slowly. His gaze, sharp enough to seem almost tangible, settled on the man before him. "No concern?" he repeated. A faint smile touched his mouth, though it carried no warmth. "Then either their king is a fool, or he believes himself several moves ahead." He rose from his chair and stepped down from the dais, the sound of his boots quiet against the stone. "Games are won by those who refuse to be rushed," he continued. "We will not stumble blindly into whatever design he has prepared." The guard shifted, fingers tightening around the hilt of his sword. "Sire, an army that advances without weapons defies reason. What strategy demands such exposure? A decoy, perhaps, or something concealed?" The king folded his hands behind his back and walked a slow circle, thoughts aligning with the patience of a veteran commander. "I have stood in more battles than most men survive to remember," he said at last. "Wars are rarely decided by what is visible. The obvious threat is often the least dangerous." He paused. "But men who march without fear—" His eyes darkened slightly. "Those are the ones worth studying." The guard hesitated again, then pressed on. "It is not only their lack of arms, my lord. Their formations are unnatural, too orderly, too calm. They advance without haste, as though time itself serves them. It is almost as if they know something we do not." For the first time, the king did not answer immediately. He turned toward the tall windows where night pressed heavily against the glass. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay the anchored fleet, silent and unreadable. An army that does not fear death is dangerous. An army that does not even prepare for it, more dangerous still. A quiet thought stirred at the edge of his certainty, unwelcome but impossible to dismiss. Confidence was a weapon he had wielded all his life. Yet experience had taught him a harder truth. When an enemy abandons the rules of war, it is usually because they have brought a different kind of battlefield. "Double the watches," the king said at last, his voice lower now. "No movement goes unreported. And send riders to the mountain posts. I want their captains awake and answering signals through the night." The guard bowed deeply, relief mixing with lingering dread. "At once, my lord." When he was gone, the king remained by the window, listening to the wind claw softly at the stone towers. Unarmed soldiers, a fearless king, a fleet that waited instead of striking. Piece by piece, the shape of the coming conflict refused to resemble any war he had known. Far out in the darkness, the tide turned, and though the city could not yet see it, the first move of the true battle had already been made. The king rose slowly, the weight of his cloak shifting behind him as he straightened to his full height. "Let them come," he said, certainty ringing through the chamber. "Let their king parade his hollow bravado. Let his soldiers march with empty hands if they wish. We are Shadow Bay. Our walls have endured centuries, and our people do not tremble at shadows. If they mistake our patience for fear, their arrogance will bury them." He moved toward the window. Twilight had begun its quiet surrender to night, and long bands of shadow stretched across the city. Out on the darkening water, the anchored ships lay still, but now there was movement upon them. The invaders were disembarking. From this height, the king watched lines of figures step onto the decks in measured order. No scrambling, no shouted commands drifting across the bay. Just controlled, deliberate motion. And the sight was stranger still upon closer inspection. Many carried no weapons at all. Rows of men and women advanced with empty hands. Some bore simple wooden staves, more like walking poles than instruments of war. Others moved with their arms relaxed at their sides, as if arriving for a ceremony rather than a battle. The king narrowed his eyes. It was unnatural, but he refused to grant it power by naming it so. "There is something beneath this," he murmured, almost to himself. "Some design not yet revealed." His jaw tightened. Whatever it is, it changes nothing. Footsteps approached behind him. A veteran general entered without ceremony, a man whose loyalty had been proven in mud and blood across decades. He had heard enough to understand the moment. "My lord," the general said, voice steady with experience, "I share the guard's concern. No army behaves this way without reason. They carry themselves like victors already, as though the outcome is decided and only the hour remains." The king turned, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "And that," he replied, "is precisely why we must not bend." He descended the final step from the dais, closing the distance between them. "Confidence is a blade," he continued. "In disciplined hands it cuts cleanly. In careless ones it turns and wounds the bearer. They want us unsettled. Doubt spreads faster than fire in a city preparing for war." He looked once more toward the silent fleet. "We will give them no such victory." The general studied him for a moment, then inclined his head. Yet even he could not fully mask the tension gathering behind his eyes. Outside, the last light bled from the horizon. On the decks below, the unarmed ranks continued to assemble. Orderly, tireless, patient. Not the movements of soldiers bracing for slaughter. The movements of people who believed they had nothing to fear. The king watched them in silence, unwilling to admit the single thought pressing quietly against the walls of his certainty. Armies do not discard their weapons unless they have found a deadlier one. Beyond the castle walls, the city laboured through the night. Archers stood in long, disciplined rows along the ramparts, their quivers heavy, bowstrings waxed and tested until each note rang true. Engineers tightened the torsion of the ballistae, feeding thick ropes through iron arms until the machines groaned with restrained power. On the mountain ridges, signal fires flickered weakly against the mist while the guards took their positions, silent shapes waiting above the narrow throat of the bay. Everything was ready. And yet the readiness did little to quiet the unease threading its way through the ranks. Veterans felt it, but did not name it. Younger soldiers sensed it without understanding why. The city had prepared for countless wars, but preparation brought comfort only when the enemy behaved as wars demanded. This enemy did not. The guard who had delivered the report lingered near the doorway, wrestling with a thought he clearly wished to leave unspoken. At last he stepped forward again. "My lord, I trust your command with my life," he said, his voice lowered by something close to reverence. "But this feels different. It is as though they conceal a blade we cannot yet see. I fear we may be bracing for the wrong strike." The king approached him without haste and placed a firm hand upon his shoulder. For a moment the ruler vanished, and only the seasoned commander remained. "Fear is not always a weakness," the king said quietly. "Often it is the mind sharpening itself against possibility. But remember this, battles are not won by guessing at shadows. They are won through discipline, preparation, and the refusal to yield to uncertainty." His grip tightened slightly, not harsh, but grounding. Whatever they hide will reveal itself soon enough, and when it does, we will meet it standing." The guard bowed, steadied, though not entirely relieved, and withdrew to resume his watch. When the door closed, the chamber seemed larger and far more silent. The king remained by the window as the last colour drained from the sky. Night gathered over the bay until the anchored fleet became little more than darker shapes within the dark. He felt the weight of the coming dawn settle across his shoulders, not as doubt, but as responsibility. A ruler could not afford the luxury of visible hesitation. His people drew strength from his certainty. If it cracked, so would the city. Still, instinct whispered. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous enemies were not the loud ones who battered gates, but the patient ones who let tension do their work. A colder gust swept in from the ocean, stirring the torches below. The smell of salt carried a faint chill, the kind that slipped beneath armour and into bone. The calm had returned. Too calm. "They believe silence will unsettle us," the king murmured, fingers resting on the worn leather of his sword hilt. "They mistake restraint for intimidation." His gaze hardened as he looked out over the water. "Shadow Bay does not bend," he said softly into the night, "and it does not break." Far below, the tide crept inward. On the anchored ships, no fires were lit. No songs rose, no orders echoed across the water, only waiting. And somewhere in that vast stillness lay a simple, dangerous truth the king had not yet allowed himself to fully consider. An enemy who seeks to frighten you makes noise. An enemy who intends something far worse lets you reassure yourself.